Hi all. I think we're about ready to start. I'm Nancy, and I am the manager of Stat Central. And for any of you who are not aware of our services, we are the statistical consulting unit at UNSW. And if you are an HDR student at UNSW or a researcher, you can come to us and get some help with your research. So if you need some study design advice or analysis advice, you can come to us and we can hopefully help you out. We also have a program of short courses and seminars. So these seminars are, this is our last one for this year. And we also have contracts for big jobs. So if you have a grant and need help with your data analysis, you can come to us and we can make an arrangement to have one of our consultants working part of their time for that particular project. And as I mentioned, this is the last one of our monthly seminar series for 2020. And today we have David Warton presenting for us. And David is a professor in maths and stats, and he is also the director of Stat Central. But his most important job is entertaining us on interesting data visualizations and things as a year-end wrap-up. So this is always a sort of a fun and interesting talk. David, take it away.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and thank you everyone for coming. So, I guess don't know if you noticed, there was an election this year in America, and yeah, this is the banner for the 538 website, Nate Silver's website, where he makes his predictions about who's going to win. Now, the pollsters and the commentary around the polls got a lot of flack after the 2016 election. Nate Silver's group didn't really go back to the drawing board and change their models. What they did was they put a lot of thought into how to communicate uncertainty around predictions and spatial predictions. And so this is what they came up with. So what happened was on election day in 2016, they gave Trump about a 30% chance of winning the election. So he wasn't the favorite, but it wasn't surprising that he won, considering sort of where the data were and we take into account spatial correlation and polling error and whatnot. So, but they copped a lot of flack for getting it wrong, and so they thought, well, how can we better communicate that we don't know who's going to win, and we think it's this way but not that way? And so yeah, so what they did was they, instead of presenting point estimates, or confidence intervals around things, they presented simulation results. So here we've got some sample simulation results for what they reckoned might happen under different runs. And so I guess on this screen here, there's like about 20 different runs of their model for what they thought might happen, and Trump wins 2 of them. And so they think Biden's going to win, but they're not sure. Then, yeah, instead of just saying 89% chance of winning, they've got all these dots on the page, right? They've got all these dots here saying, well, maybe Biden will win by this much or this much or this much or this much, or maybe he'll lose. We're not sure, but we think he's going to win, like about almost 90% chance of him winning. And similarly down here with histograms. So we all have times in life where we want to present an estimate with uncertainty around it. Usually we use confidence intervals, like I guess in papers. When it comes to mapping and mapping spatial uncertainty, that's a tricky one. I guess this is another way to think about the problem. Instead of trying to, we could present sort of possible answers. If it's like an important question and you want to get across, it really emphasizes the idea of uncertainty around your estimates. This is one way to do it, presenting a histogram of results or presenting a dot plot or something, or alternative maps in a spatial context. Okay, so still on the election, I confess to have spent a whole lot of 2020, even late 2019, obsessing over this thing and wondering how it was going to work out. One of the more interesting sort of ways of looking at it, a bunch of different people did this. What they did was they took the 2020 polls, so these were the 2020 polls, and then they thought about what might happen if the polls were wrong by the same amount they got wrong last time. So if you did that, then North Carolina isn't actually won by Biden, it's going to be lost by him, and a lot of other things move closer to the line. So I then went and photoshopped on the actual results, and that's not a bad prediction of what actually happened. That's not, more or less, like looking at polling error from last time and adding that to the polls gave you pretty close to what actually ended up happening. The main thing it got wrong was Florida, and so Florida results came out early, so there were a lot of people that just had a big scare in the first couple of hours results came in. But then when other results started coming in, it was things changed fairly quickly. The red dots are all left of the blue arrows though. So it looks like the polling error was actually bigger this time than last time, even though people had thought a lot about how to correct it. It was bigger in most states. And yeah, the biggest one was actually, if you take out those arrows, the biggest one was Wisconsin. It was still a win for Biden, but there was a polling error of almost 4% there, which is quite surprising. Yeah, so that was this election thing. There was also this other thing you might have heard of, this Black Lives Matter thing. So support for Black Lives Matter as a movement has been increasing steadily. It's been building momentum for a couple of years. The New York Times left off the x-axis on this plot, but otherwise it it tells us the story. So there were more people that didn't support it than supported it 2 years ago, and it steadily rose to get a bit of support here. And then when George Floyd was killed and the protests started, suddenly it was in the public spotlight, and everyone got it basically, and it jumped up to almost a 30% sort of spread in terms of supporting versus not supporting the movement. So yeah, I guess this is an interesting sort of graph of what often happens in history, that you've got momentum towards something, you've got sort of something building, and then there's some critical event that crystallizes sort of the idea that brings everyone together, and it suddenly becomes mainstream, which I think is what's happened here. All right, so there was also this other thing you might have heard of, like it's some sort of pandemic thing that happened this year. And I guess one of the main messages that came out of that was that people that make signs aren't always very good at maths. So here we've got someone who's struggling with the concept of the area of a square and how it relates to the length of the sides. But anyway, that's cool. Here's someone who's struggling with Pythagoras' theorem, and how far apart people actually are from each other if they're diagonally across from each other in a square grid. I think actually, maybe Pythagoras is getting upset with that one, but in their defense, you could actually arrange 4 people in 3 dimensions so that they're all 6 feet away from each other. What you do is you have the ones on a diagonal up higher than the ones down here, and so that it makes a regular tetrahedron, and then you can sort of rotate that to a square. So it is actually possible that this plot here is correct. If it's like a multi-level restaurant, they're taking that into account with their sort of suggestions and seating structure. There's no defense for the typos, though. I think that's just not right. Okay. So what else has happened this year? There's a whole lot of changes that have been happening this year in response to coronavirus. So I guess one thing that's happened is that people suddenly like regional New South Wales. So regional New South Wales took a really big hit with the bushfires, and they rely quite heavily on tourist season. And tourist season was basically cancelled because of the bushfires, and things were looking quite rough out there. Coronavirus didn't really help, but occupancy rates in regional areas have bounced back to almost what they were pre-pandemic, whereas, and in fact, they're higher now than in the city, which is not a thing in the past. So regional New South Wales is becoming a much more popular place than it used to be. Thanks to Eve Slavich for this one. She also suggested this whole Google Trends way of looking at the problem. So I don't know if you know anyone who has hired a caravan and gone to Broken Hill recently. I know at least 3 people that have. And if you look on Google Trends, you look at the number of people who have searched for Broken Hill based in New South Wales in the last year, then it's doubled, right? Broken Hill is twice as popular as a place as it was a year ago. Bali, on the other hand, has it's not as popular as it used to be, and in fact, for much of the second half of this year, Broken Hill has been considered a more interesting place than Bali by New South Wales residents, and I think that's fair, personally. Okay, so here's a graph. This is an interesting one from, I think it was Mark Donohoe that gave us this one. So, yeah, so what we've got here is a whole bunch of time series for spending in different categories. So they've all been standardized to start at 100, and the value that they end up in is emphasized at the ends there. That's not an average, that's just where it ended up in early November this year. So pubs and venues have been getting hammered. So they're currently, spending in pubs and venues is half of what it was almost half of what it was a year ago. And it was lower for a while there too. So they're really struggling. Public transport, the same deal, but we don't have to feel sorry for them because it's basically government subsidized anyway. Road tolls, yeah, so they're down a bit. Travel, obviously, travel got hammered towards the start of this year, and it has been recovering, and it's now only down 20% from the levels of travel expenses that we saw a year ago. The nature of that travel, as you have seen on the previous slide, has changed. So yeah, supermarkets is an interesting one. So supermarkets, you may remember that people sort of went a little bit crazy at Woolies around March, April. And so you can see that in this big peak here where spending in supermarkets looks like it just about doubled around March, April. And then I guess everybody had what they needed because it then declined and has been below regular levels, slightly below for most of the year since that time. I'm not sure if that's because people are still eating through their stocks or if it's a change in behavior because people have started getting more Uber Eats, for example. So yeah, Uber Eats is a big win. I mean, look at this, food delivery, and that's restaurants as well, changing their business models. It's almost quadrupled food delivery services over the last year, which is pretty crazy. Yeah, online gambling is also a bit crazy. Yeah, alcohol, we know everybody's been drinking a whole lot more. Look at this jump, it looks like it's gone up almost double. It's gone up a huge amount in a short period of time and then sort of declined again, but it's still up considerably on what it was before. That's probably partly compensating for the lack of pub activity, I guess. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. The world has changed somewhat this year, and some of these changes are here to stay, like this food delivery thing. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. Okay, thanks Nancy for pointing out the whole scented candle issue. We should spare a thought for the scented candle industry, which is going through a tough time at the moment. So Amazon reviews of unscented candles, they're up about 4.5, maybe slightly down over the last year, but they're still up fairly high. Scented candles, on the other hand, the average review for top 3 scented candle brands used to be 4, it's now almost 3. It's really dived down quite steeply. What's happening there? Well, the proportion of reviews mentioning lack of scent, complaining that the scented candles don't smell of anything. Well, there was a whole lot of them April, May, and again October, November, which coincides with high incidence of COVID in the American population. Lack of sense, loss of sense of smell, of course, being the leading symptom. Yeah, I wanted to show you this graph just to show you how you can make stuff look pretty, but also really, really, really hard to understand. It's not just that this is in Spanish. Even speaking a little bit of Spanish won't help you with this. You need to spend a long time with this to work out what on earth is happening. So there is sometimes a good graph will look nice and also be easy to understand. They're trying to make something, I think they have lost a lot in understanding in trying to make it look fancy. What each of these plots is a time series of the worth of different companies or different wealthy families in Spain over time. So this is the x-axis and this is the y-axis, which are confusingly on the same axis, which doesn't make it any easier. Yeah, so what we're doing, just to trace this line over time, and that's what it's graphing. It's just a single line of the worth of this guy over time. and the pandemic hit here, and so his worth suddenly dropped down there. This one suddenly dropped down there. So they've all got a drop off sort of April, May because of the pandemic. It's hard to see, it's hard to understand what's going on because of the way they've done it. It's a clever idea trying to use notes in there, but yeah, it didn't really work. Something else that hasn't worked here is that they've got it on an absolute scale. So you can see there's this huge drop off here. It makes it look like this organization is really hurting, but actually they're actually worth more than all the other ones. They're worth sort of 3 times as much as the rest. And so on an absolute scale, you would expect a different drop, a bigger drop. This drop in percentage terms is actually less than that one. So it's also a little bit misleading the way they've chosen to present the results here. Yeah, so you've got, this is something to think about. Do I want it on absolute scale or on a relative scale, log scale? Log scale makes sense for proportional stuff that's relative to the size of the original thing. Talking about changes in worth, if you got lots of money, then it's really the 5% loss that matters, not the $10 million, right? Okay, so here's another one, which is looking pretty. It's kind of a bit hard to understand here. I kind of like, I'm in two minds. I like the idea of this one. I like what they're getting at, but it didn't quite pull it off for me. Yeah, so part of the problem is they got a legend. They got a legend that's covering half of the plot. Yeah, so they're looking at patterns as a function of time of day here. So midnight's up here, here's the morning, midday, afternoon, evening. And they're looking at internet use. Closer to the origin means there's less internet use. It took me ages looking at this plot to see that. There's this 0.51 thing. And I think they needed to repeat that a few places to help people understand that. The idea of having mapping around a circle, I guess the reason to do that is if you've got a cyclical variable and you want to look at patterns within the cycle. So time of day, what's happening at different times of day. You could also do this for time of year or for direction. Yeah, so that's the idea. So they're tracing it over time. It's going round and round and round and round and round in circles. But the cost from doing that is that the variable of interest, internet use, it's no longer on a single scale. So you can't say higher is better. You're looking at how far from the origin it is. It's just a bit harder to make sense of. Yeah, so the other thing that makes this difficult is, yeah, it's just hard. This is hard. So this is somewhere, I think it's America, after shelter-in-place orders were introduced. Blue is after shelter-in-place orders were introduced. Grey is before. And you can see there's kind of 2 clusters of grey. There's an inside one here and an outside one there. That'll be weekdays and weekends. I think this is weekdays here, and I think it's weekends on the outside. So there's not that much internet use on weekdays pre-pandemic. Or in the morning, sort of pre-pandemic. After the pandemic, people seem to be staying up later using their internet more and using it a lot more during the day. So the blue's further out than the grey. And I guess the staying up later is interesting. I guess they don't have to commute to work. Yeah. On the other hand, sort of in the evenings, they seem to be using it less than they were on the weekends, I think that would be. So maybe if you're sitting at home watching Netflix a lot, then you don't do it as much in the evening. I don't know. I'm not sure what's happening there. It's a little confusing, but if we believe the legend, overall household usage was up about 26%, which makes sense to me. But it's hard to see from the graph. You see more from the legend than the graph, I think. But it is something that's worth thinking about. All right, this idea is worth thinking about. Sort of taking cyclical variables, mapping them around a circle in order to put the emphasis on patterns within the cycle. All right, so yeah, this is one of the more striking sort of patterns that happened this year, is a sort of change in GDP. It kind of fell off a cliff. It looks like there's an error here, right? It looks like there's a mistake. Someone entered the wrong number there because it just doesn't fit the rest of the pattern. And this pattern, this is going back 60 years, right? It actually reminds me of another one. This is the most depressing graph I've got for you today. This is one that also looks like an error. What we're talking about here is carbon dioxide levels as estimated from ice cores over the last 800,000 years. The highest historic level was around about 300, around about here, which we passed just before 1950. And we've currently jumped up to there, and we're still increasing. This is a very scary thing to look at. We're doing a bit of an experiment on the planet. We don't know how it's going to go. It's not much fun, this graph. And for an optimistic thinker, someone who likes to be positive, this is probably the most challenging thing that we've got to deal with. Yeah, so how are we at with that whole climate change thing? So the pandemic has reduced the rate of carbon emissions. Carbon dioxide concentrations are still going up because we're still emitting more than it's being absorbed by the environment, but less than it used to be this year. I don't have the reference here. This was a paper in July in Nature. You can see that the carbon emissions just dropped off quite markedly, almost 20% drop. It was a really big drop, sort of March, April, and it stayed down in June, and it would still be down now, but probably by less. And yeah, compared to historically, this is a bigger drop in the year-on-year carbon emissions than any other time in recorded history. In percentage terms, I'm not sure if it's the biggest, but it's pretty close. And yeah, so there you go. So the pandemic has done something about climate change. What has been happening? Well, the main thing that has happened is that people have stopped driving to work in America. That's the main thing that's happened. There's a few other things as well, but it is mostly about ground transport. And there's also some plane stuff happening as well here, right? We've got aviation as well, which has dropped off. All of these values are below zero. So there's been a reduction, year-on-year reduction in transport because of the pandemic. Now, you might think, sure, that's like a one-off, but I don't think it is. I think we've established some patterns this year that will persist into the future. There is much more appreciation now of workplace flexibility. A lot of people working from home, a lot of workplaces actually encouraging it. It's cheaper for workplaces for people to stay at home. They don't need as much floor space, and everyone's happier. In some cases, they're more productive. So there's a lot of businesses that are moving to a model where people aren't at work all week. They might come in, say, 3 days a week. This team comes in on these days. This team comes in on these days. Everybody gets to see each other on a regular basis, sometime or other. The people you work most closely with, you see most often. But yeah, there's that sort of stuff happening. And yeah, business-related travel. There's a lot of people working in sales that are actually, they used to spend a third of their time flying around the world selling people stuff, and they're finding that they might actually be selling more just over Zoom. And so there's a lot of patterns, virtual conferencing. Some virtual conferences have been good, some not so much, but there's a lot of patterns, a lot of things that we've tried. Some of these things are going to stick around. And so, yeah, I don't see these reductions in ground transport and aviation sort of going away. Maybe they'll get less, but I think we have found some ways that on an ongoing basis they're cheaper and they're good for people, and I think they will stick around to some extent going forwards. Personally. Yeah, okay, so also talking about climate change, here's generative capacity in the national energy network, the national energy market in Australia. And whereas, yeah, the bad guys are grey, brown, and black, they're all reducing. They're all lower now than they were in 2007. Brown is being phased out. Black is they're all actually lower. And the energy companies actually want to reduce them faster than the government does. The government's actually been giving them incentives to stay open because for reasons we'll see on the next slide. But yeah, so what's been happening, solar and wind are cheaper forms of energy than coal or gas nowadays. And so all of the investment in new energy is going there. It is now at the point where half of the generation capacity in the national energy market is from renewables. That doesn't mean half of the energy that's produced is from renewables. It's about a third, a bit under a third, because the sun doesn't shine all the time. But yeah, we're up to a half. And yeah, the blue, that's been around since like 1920. The main change that has this teeny little colored ribbon here. It was that big before, now it's this big, and it's getting bigger and bigger all the time. This is great news, right? And that's actually happening pretty much without government intervention, more or less. So why is the government trying to keep the coal plants open when they want to close? This is why, because if you look at it this time of day, see, this time of day graph is easier to read than the wheel, isn't it? We could have done this one on a wheel, but yeah, it's kind of easier to understand this way with the scale, common scale that you can read across on all the way. Anyway, so you can see the solar sources of energy work during the day, and they don't so much work during the night to ensure base load electricity. The black coal, the coal plants are going hard at night and then burning low during the day to compensate for that. And that is the main mechanism we have at the moment to balance baseload energy on the network. There is another thing that we could try. It's called batteries. And I think the government is realizing this because it's cheaper, because they can actually make money out of it. You would have heard of the battery farm that Tesla put in South Australia. It cost 160 million to put in. They make 30 million a year by buying energy when it's cheap and selling it when it's expensive. So that that farm will pay itself off in a couple of years. And so there's a whole bunch of battery farms currently being built around the place, not because the government is strategically investing in it, just because people have worked out that they can make money out of it. And so we could see a fairly quick transition over the coming decade to 100% renewable. I'm calling 100% renewable by 2030, whether the government wants it or not. That's what I'm calling. All right, so it's not just here, it's happening in other countries too. So yeah, here's a nice graph of Portugal. Unfortunately, the data only goes to here and the rest of it was someone's projections. I'm assuming they actually knew what they were doing when they made that projection. Yeah, so this one comes from Beautiful News. Nancy suggested this to me as a website for some pretty graphs. So thanks, Nancy, for this one. Yeah, so here's another. They've got a whole bunch of happy graphs on the Beautiful News website, so feel free to have a scroll sometime if you need some cheering up. 85% of the world's nuclear warheads have been decommissioned since in the last 30 years. That's 30 odd years. That's pretty cool. Most of it's happening from Russia, right? So America did some work early on, then they stopped. Russia, has gone from 40,000 down to about 5,000. That's a huge drop, and that's the main reason for this. Now, looking at these graphs that you'll notice, they're just line graphs, okay? They're just line graphs, but here we've stacked it to show the composition for the different countries. But by having they're making it look pretty by having a common color in the background and then sort of filling in everything down to 0 here. That's a good thing to do if you're graphing a quantity, so that it's like how much of something there is. So this is how much coal there is, and that's how many nuclear warheads there is. Sometimes you're graphing an index or something where it doesn't make sense to do that. But if you're graphing a quantity, sort of filling it in like this is a visually appealing way of saying, look, there used to be this much and now there's only this much. So that's quite cool. Yeah, so here's another cool graph from Beautiful News. They're talking about smoking and they've made it look like a cigarette butt. So this is something that happened this year. There's a lot of people staying home with not much to do. And I guess they've decided to quit smoking. Over 1 million people by June in England had decided to quit smoking, more so than 1 million more people than normal decided to quit smoking during this period, that's a pretty big number, really. Okay, and this will be my last graph. So this is also from Beautiful News. It's this one and the cigarette one. They're kind of blurring the line between graphs and art, right? So they're trying to do something. They're being quite creative in how they present data. So down here they're talking about how there's heaps more people living in democracies than there were 40 years ago, and they've plotted it to make it look like it's seats in Parliament. And when they're talking about literacy, they make it look like a book. So it's been quite sort of clever in how they've done that. But yeah, looking at this graph, the big picture message here is that despite what you think of this year, the world is a better place to live now than it was 5, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It's getting better all the time in lots of different ways. And in a small part, we're all actually helping make that happen. So well done, team. Good job. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, David. If anybody has any questions or they want to comment on any of the plots, go ahead and type something into the chat, or raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can ask your question. Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions, just a lot of nice comments saying this is really neat, and especially about the election predictions. Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. We will have the video and slides available to you shortly, and have a really great holiday time. And I should note that our next monthly seminar won't be until February, and so look out in January for our announcements of what we'll be talking about. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.